Okay, so I think, Greg, you're going to start us off with talking a little bit. So we had a few readings from Ayn Rand, and we want to situate those readings and talk about her um, approach to intellectual freedom through the years or through her career. And Greg's going to start us off on that track.
Yeah, we had more readings. I think for all the previous sessions, we had one, maybe two readings. There were several this time. So let's just say a bit about that. I mean, intellectual freedom, particularly freedom of speech, was a theme for Rand's throughout her career, certainly throughout the period starting in 1962 and ending, just before her death, when she was writing about the current events of the time. But even you can see it as a theme in Atlas Shrugged, and then her writing prior to that. And one thing that she's always interested in when she's talking about it is its connection to economic freedom, so that these aren't two separate things, that some people are for freedom of speech and other people are for the freedom to do business and property rights, but rather, there are people who claim to be for one or for the other, but to not consistently be for either compromises your ability to be for the other, and the intrusions on the one type of freedom, either of them, create intrusions on the other. So this is a big interest to her of hers, and it's connected more broadly to her interest in the idea of mind-body integration, that the mind isn't something that's separate from our bodies, but rather we're a unified creature of mind and body that lives in this world bodily by the work of our minds. But more specifically into when and why she was on about this, there was a period in the early 1960s when she was especially concerned about what she saw as a clear and present danger to free speech, real threats of censorship. And if you look at her first articles on topical issues in 1962, when she started editing her objectivist newsletter, she identified censorship and antitrust as the two big threats, the two issues that you should choose to focus on if you're trying to fight for freedom in the culture. And she was particularly concerned with things that the Kennedy administration was doing in each of these realms, and with the idea that both of these areas of law were non-objective. The laws were written in such a way that they gave wide and vague powers to administration officials to just bring up cases against companies or speakers of various sorts, and that the judges had no guidance. The laws were not objective, so that they couldn't know what the judges would find, and the judges couldn't know what to find when these charges were brought. She was particularly concerned with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission under Kennedy, as being censoring speech on the airwaves. And we talked a little bit about that last time in connection with her article on the property status of airwaves, which was written during this period of intense concern. The other period when considerations of censorship and free speech were particularly prevalent in her writing was in early 1973, where it was prompted by a series of obscenity cases that came before the Supreme Court. Her speech censorship, local and express, is occasioned by that, and the article that was an optional reading for today, and the article Thought Control is a sort of follow-up on censorship, local and express, where she's exploring these details in more depth. We read that for today. And you can see in these articles, again, the connection to antitrust law, though in a somewhat different way. In the earlier articles, she was concerned about the prosecution, among other things, about the prosecution under antitrust law of media companies. Here, we also see the idea that the non-absolutism of the rights of property, contract, and association, which were kind of instilled into our legal system by the antitrust law, is providing a precedent for the encroachment of the rights to freedom of speech. So you see that in Thought Control, and in the other piece we read for today, Ideas versus Men. Also in that piece, you see the concern present in Thought Control and in much of her writing that you have threats to freedom of speech and to economic freedom from the very people who are thought of as defenders of them. So Ideas versus Men is about Ronald Coates, who's a conservative economist perceived as a defender of free markets, and she's saying this really, what he's saying about speech in this undercuts the defense of free markets. And then the judges whose rulings she's critiquing in thought control are conservative justices who, well, are conservative justices. But the ones who are defending free speech lamely in their dissents are liberal justices, and yet they're unable to do it, right? Because, or so she argues, because of their acceptance of positions that are in economic rights that are in conflict with freedom. And then just one other, two other articles to mention. Political crimes. This article was occasioned by her concern that the New Left, beginning in particular with the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1965, an allegedly pro-free speech movement, was actually undermining freedom of speech by conflating speech and action. So this is the kind of precursor to the Occupy movements we've seen in more recent years, where students were taking over the campus at Berkeley, forcibly occupying spaces and so forth, and claiming to be doing this in the name of free speech, claiming that they're demonstrating and taking over areas was freedom of speech. And in the year, so this was starting in 1965, she was commenting on this in an article called "The Cashing In the Student Rebellion." In the years that followed, we had a kind of escalation of this, including riots at Columbia University, and eventually the Weather Underground basically committing terrorism in the name of leftist causes, or what they saw as, liberation causes. And you had, in all of this context, people minimizing these kinds of crimes, these kinds of acts of terror and just other kinds of crimes, on the ground that they're merely political crimes. And therefore we should have more sympathy for them. The book shouldn't be thrown at the criminal, so to speak. And that's the context of the political crimes article. And then we're going to close with, we have some excerpts from Galt's speech for the New Intellectual and Introducing Objectivism. These are all late 50s, early 60s pieces. And I think of these as providing a kind of broad integration to all the preceding, both the themes we're discussing throughout today and really what we've discussed throughout the whole seminar. It brings us back to the fundamentality of philosophy to politics, and the need for a moral revolution to provide the explicit foundation that freedom always needed and never had. And I think that's the kind of fundamental message to take away from Rand's thinking about politics, that to really defend freedom and capitalism, we need a moral revolution. Okay, so Ankar, do you want to, so we're gonna proceed by going basically in order through the questions that we posed as discussion questions this time, and looking at some of what you said and adding some of our own thoughts on the issue. Ankar, do you want to start us off with the first question?
Sure. So the first question was, to remind everyone, why does Rand think that, and then quoting from the article Ideas versus Men, quote, "The demand for freedom of ideas had to precede freedom of trade, that without the heroic struggle of those who fought for a free market in ideas, no such thing as a free market in goods would or could have been discovered." That closes the quote from Ayn Rand. And then it was, can you think of any further evidence for or against her claim? And we'll turn to that second, but let's get a little bit of what we think about the actual claim and what the claim amounts to. And if you've read the piece Ideas versus Men, you'll see that the broader context of what she's talking about is that the person she's critiquing, Mr. Coase, Ronald Coase, in the argument that he's giving, it's that he seems to think that this is a historical accident. So part of, I think, the context to get is she's thinking about the history of the development of these ideas and these political principles, and that there's a logic to that development. I think that is what she's arguing. And then it will be relevant for thinking about the present day and some counter evidence that we'll talk about, that one might think, well, doesn't this suggest that the progression could be different? But I think so. She's thinking of it as situated in history. And so Daniel brought up on the Facebook group some of this, that I think it's right what he emphasizes, particularly the last part, that it's being connected to what goes on in the Enlightenment and why. So part of what Daniel wrote is that, quote, freedom of ideas had to precede freedom of trade, as the faculty of reason is the fundamental basis for living. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Then skipping a little bit, he says, understanding reality and therefore realizing that free trade or free trading is the way of interaction with other people. And then he closes with, it's the era of the 17th and 19th centuries when Enlightenment movement preceded the Industrial Revolution. And I think that last just to think, yeah, if you're thinking of the broad historical trends, it's you get an Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution comes at the tail end of it. It doesn't come at the start, though you can think there's some industrialization going, but thinking of it as an industrial revolution. So putting the emphasis on revolution, that comes at the end of the Enlightenment and carries on into the 19th century. So you can think of that as 18th, 19th century. And I think that is, so that's part of what she's thinking about and saying that there's a logic here. There's an order that is not accidental. And I think part of the way to think about it is it's true that reason is the fundamental basis for living, as Daniel put it, but you can distinguish two aspects of reason. So one is that it's the producer of knowledge, and particularly then if you think of what's going on historically, of the new science or of mathematical science and the tremendous push forward in knowledge that they're getting the idea coming out of the Renaissance. It was sort of a pining for the old world and that we're never going to be able to match what the Greeks and Romans did. This is like some kind of miracle almost, like you're getting at when they're rediscovering it. But by the time then you're getting to the mathematical science and you're getting Galileo and you're getting Newton, they have an idea, which I think is right, is that they're surpassing the ancient world. They've gone beyond the ancient world, and we have knowledge that the ancients had no awareness of, and a vast amount, not just like here one piece of item of knowledge, a vast amount, and that we can see this is going to be an ever increasing progression. So it's both we've discovered much more, and there's a whole bunch more to discover, and we're able to do that if we use the proper method. So there's a massive emphasis on what the proper method is and trying to define the scientific method. And if you think of all the philosophers at this period, they're all intensely interested in method and in science and trying to specify. Now, I think from Ayn Rand's perspective, they don't get it fully right of what the method is, but that's what they're focused on and trying to understand. And from that perspective, there's a method, we can get unlimited progress in terms of knowledge, and what can stop us and what is stopping us. So it's not just a theoretical construct. What is stopping us is governmental authorities wielding force to try to shut us up. And whether you take the figure of a Galileo and the church, or you take many of the Enlightenment figures who are on the run from government, because their ideas are in either so directly religious terms, blasphemy and so on, or in more secular terms, they're challenging the authority, the secular authorities in various kinds of ways. But I mean, this is true of Voltaire, it is true of Locke, it's true of many of the Enlightenment figures. And it's a later integration to get that what the mind is capable of in terms of its discovery of knowledge and of pushing forward is intimately connected and involved in production. So the older view, but older and I think from Ayn Rand's perspective, wrong, but understandable, is that production isn't the exercise of the mind, and certainly the mind at its most powerful and active. It's discovering theoretical knowledge, it's pushing forth mathematics and science and philosophy. But production is It's sort of, you just go through a routine that's been discovered long ago in agriculture, and in various other building houses and so on. And the more understanding of that, no, the mind is involved in this. And if the more involved it gets, the more that this can be not just, well, yeah, we're doing what my great grandfather did, but we can do new and novel and more productive things. And you're starting to get that already with, I mean, early in the Enlightenment, Bacon is talking about this kind of thing, the use of knowledge, and that a new conception of progress, sort of material economic progress, that's starting to be. But it's really, you have to see the knowledge in action over a period of time, I think, to really get, oh yeah, this is a crucial new thing as well in the new world that's different in scale of what went on in the ancient world, and then to demand the freedom for this as well. So I think that's what she's arguing, that there's a necessary progression here. If you understand, and if you take an inductive approach to what they're discovering and the principles they're trying to formulate and why, and the opposition they're facing, and what first stands out is the opposition against the discovery of knowledge, I think. And it later stands out that, well, if knowledge is involved in production, all these interferences with production amount to an assault on the mind. And we have to think of this as a package. And that's what intellectual freedom then is getting at, that it connects to the issue of production as well. I mean, Greg, do you want to add or comment on that?
Just a few thoughts here. We were talking about intellectual property last time, and you might think of intellectual property rights as something that wouldn't come into existence until somebody really made this complete integration that we were talking about and applied the need for the freedom of the mind that we've been talking about to the role of production. And in that connection, the history of IP rights are really interesting. The United States was a really big leap forward. Its early patent and copyright laws, particularly patent laws, as compared to England, which was the kind of pioneer in freedom in this respect up until then. And so that's just a history that's worth studying. It's something I've read a little about and would like to learn more about. The other thing that it occurred to me to just mention is when we talk about the need for freedom of speech and for freedom of thought, we especially are concerned about the freedom from the government. And we talked about, you talked about these early Enlightenment or early modern philosophers, people like Locke and so forth, being on the run from the government. And I think that's right. It's worth maybe saying a word also about whether there are ways in which non-governmental actors can violate freedom of speech. Rand says, and objectivists have tended to say no, and to be, in saying no, responding to the idea that a company by its corporate policies might be violating your freedom of speech. And I think that's right. But if we're thinking of a case like jihadist terrorists blowing up your magazine because they think that they don't want you publishing the kind of pictures you're publishing, or a case of just, you know, people beating you up because your religious views or your views on any other issue are different from the ones that they think are right, right? Whether we call that exactly a violation of freedom of speech or not, it's exercising force against you in a way that's making you a victim of violence for your speech. And it's the government's job to protect you from that. And so when we say that people were victims of government suppressing their freedom of speech, that's true, but it's not like the government doesn't have a positive role here to play in protection of this freedom. It's just that it doesn't have a special positive role to play here, because by protecting you from the initiation of physical force, for any reason, doesn't matter why the person initiates physical force, by saying you can't beat people up, you can't shoot them, you can't rob from them, and so forth, it then protects you from the only means that people other than the government could have to violate your freedom of speech. and there's not a need for additional protections, as we'll talk about later. But there is an important positive role for the government, which is accomplished through the defending of your ordinary rights.
And I think when I haven't done a full survey, but I've done a partial survey of Ayn Rand. So I agree, objectivists will often say that an individual can't violate your freedom of speech. Sure, her formulations are only a government can censor. And I think that's important, that because I think it is that when one thinks of it as you're banned from doing this, that's a government, and only a government can do this. But that someone's targeting your exercise of this right, I think and for sure the Charlie Hebdo and the intimidation of publishers and writers to comment negative, I mean, from the perspective of the intimidators, to comment negatively on Islam, is an attempt that they will not comment, so that they will not exercise their right. But it is a test also of the government. Yes. They're doing it partly because they expect, or have come, unfortunately, to be right to expect that the government's not going to step in and defend in a principled, uncompromising way the individual's right to freedom of speech. And in that sense, then it's akin to censorship.
Yeah, and one of the worst things governments do, or some governments do, as bad as some positive violations of your rights that some governments engage in, right, is the selective failure to defend your rights. So if you think about, racist towns, for example, there were laws on the books that said you couldn't, lynch a black man, or couldn't lynch anyone until they applied to black men as well as anyone else. But you couldn't just kill someone. But, it was known that there's no judge and no jury that will convict in this town a white person of doing something to a black person. And there are all kinds of cases where the government doesn't prosecute or goes lenient on some category of crime or some category of criminals, and thereby creates a kind of anarchy in that sphere where people are under the threat of force from one another, whether it's about speech or about anything else, but often it's about issues of speech, or sometimes. And there's a real worry that this is happening over, religious speech, particularly criticisms of Islam in some areas.
Yeah. Let's take part of the question, this first question about Rand arguing or claiming that the freedom of thought and freedom of speech, so intellectual freedom, had to precede the demand for economic freedom. We asked, can you think of either further evidence in favor or against this claim? And I think one of the most interesting things we got was some evidence, at least possibly counter evidence to this claim. And I think it is right that one has to think about this kinds of situation if one's trying to understand what Ayn Rand, both what she's saying and whether it's right or not. So Robert wrote, if the battle for intellectual freedom must precede the battle for economic freedom, what about those countries such as China and Vietnam, which, in parentheses, arguably, which possess a great deal of economic freedom, but very little intellectual freedom? Close the quote from Robert. And I think, yes, this is for sure one of the major things one has to think about. And you can bring it up for China and Vietnam. You can bring it a little more widely than many of the so-called Asian tigers do not have what you would consider as intellectual freedom, and that it seemed like the direction in which they're getting more freedom was primarily economic. And so isn't it just, okay, maybe historically Ayn Rand is right about what happened from the Enlightenment, but is it right that there's a logic to it and that it's necessary? Or is it, that's what happened, but it can happen in different kinds of ways. And that's a major piece of evidence or apparent counter evidence that one should think about. And part of the way that I think about this is, it's important that it's a historical claim, and that what's happening in the Enlightenment through, so the 17th and 19th centuries, through the founding of America and the Industrial Revolution and the enormous explosion in progress in the 19th century. And that's not just economic progress, but explosion in scientific knowledge, in artistic developments and innovation. That had never occurred before. So they're not modeling on anything. They can't look to other cultures or civilizations and say, oh, that's what's happening, and we're interested in this, and we're going to implement this aspect of what is going on. And so, where that is the context in the 20th century, that it's, I think in thinking about these, you have to think of a China, of a Vietnam, of a Malaysia, of an Indonesia, as now that how their governments can operate is you have all kinds of examples of the Western governments, including the foundation of the US and how that has worked out over 150 years, what it has led to. And you have the development of all kinds of the institutions of capitalism. So part of what you get in the 19th century as well is an enormous development and progress in the institutions of business and of markets. I mean, a growing of stock exchanges, of a real specialty in the financing of business, so an explosion in the understanding of credit, all kinds of developments in accounting, which are major things in terms of running these enormous businesses, and of thinking of across decades of production, as we've talked about in regard to property, that's part of what is going on, an enormous range of looking into the future and planning for the future. And that needs all kinds of institutions, including things like intellectual property and the patent system. And they can now model on these. And I think it's different to think then, would it have to be that they have to first adopt full intellectual freedom, and then they'll get to economic freedom? I don't think that there's any reason why that it would have to be then when this knowledge has been discovered and implemented, and you can see what its implementation is. I think you need some intellectual freedom in a de facto sense. So people actually have to be able to think. They have to be able to produce and keep their property in a certain way, but they don't keep it in, I think China for sure, they don't keep it in a principled way. They don't keep it by a full legal system that even protects their property rights, and that the government can sweep in and does regularly sweep in and just negate their property rights. And certainly it negates their intellectual freedom. I mean, the whole censorship. China has a massive amount of censorship and censorship of the internet and of online activity. So I think the context here is different, and that countries like China and the developments in Asia, you have to think of them as parasitical in an important way on the discoveries that have happened in the West from the Enlightenment on into the 20th century. And they would not have been able to do what they did absent having that as a model and having the experience of that, or being able to look at that, which you could not do in the Enlightenment because it's the first time it's being done. So Greg, you want to add to that?
There's also the issue of how did Robert put it? They arguably possess a great deal of economic freedom. And I think that arguably is important. They possess the freedom in China in that they're being allowed to do this, but not in that there's a principle accepted whereby the government might not clamp down on it tomorrow, might not seize or nationalize property tomorrow, might not change the terms of these things tomorrow. So there's not established there a principle that they can trust. And I don't know that there could be established, I don't think there could be established in law a principle that they could trust reliably over time only in the economic realm and not in the political or intellectual realms. Maybe Singapore or someplace like that, where there's a longer history of economic freedom with censorship and such, or with less other freedoms, would be a better example than China. But even there, they're not as censorious as someplace like China was, and I don't think even there they have absolute economic freedom. I don't think any place does. So there's that, and it's also worth thinking about in the history of Europe as well as other places how freedom developed when it did. A lot of times there would be de jure freedom and de facto freedom, in that there was just a neglect by the rulers and not clamping down, and then that would enable a kind of flourishing of intellectual activity that would then, when there were attempts to later clamp back down on it or suppress it, would later lead people to think, no, this is wrong, we need, and then to start defending the freedom in principle. And I think you see that both in the case of freedom of speech and in cases of, what we'd call economic freedom. And it would be really nice to have more of that documented, or if it has been, I've not read enough about this history, but there's even, in the case of the United States, right, the formation of the United States, the idea that there was a period of neglect by the crown of what was going on in the colonies, and then when the crown started to impose things it was always able to impose but hadn't for some time, there was real reaction back by the colonists that led to the revolution. And I think there are other examples of that kind of a phenomenon.
Gordon has a comment in the chat. He says, the principle in China regarding economic freedom is that so long as what you do does not violate the rules and standards of the Chinese Communist Party, you're okay to do that.
Yeah, but those rules and standards could change at the whim of for the party leaders, right? And the party leaders can change. So that's not so much a rule in the rational sense of rule of law. It's not a principle. It's just what it's like to be under a leash. It's how the people who hold the leash are gripping it these days.
And another aspect of this that I think we'll come back to when we talk about more just not sort of the historical development of this, but just thinking of the intellectual relationships between intellectual freedom, political freedom, economic freedom. I think it's important to think of a case like China as the kind of censorship that exists, because it's massive amount, has all kinds of impact on people's economic freedom. That is, on what they can do with their property. So I would put it much wider than the rules and standards of the Chinese Communist Party, unless you get that the rules or standards include no dissemination of any ideas that we disapprove of. So the control of the internet has to mean that these companies cannot do all kinds of things economically that they might do, that they might experiment with. It's not an accident that most of the innovation in the tech world occurs in America still, and not in China and not in Vietnam. They can emulate and copy as they do, and often, I think, steal intellectual property of, whether we're talking about hardware, copying Apple, or software developments. So there's imitators of Amazon and imitators of Facebook, and so, but it doesn't go the other way around, that China, there's all these new things and we're emulating what they do. And you have to think of that as that's because when there's intellectual restrictions, there's restrictions on thinking about how to produce and what you can produce and what will what the government will cry that you're running afoul of what we said you should not be doing. So, and the easiest thing then is to be very timid and very cautious. You can't be like an Uber if what's going to happen is not you're going to be fined, but you're going to disappear and maybe be killed or put in some godforsaken jail and never to be heard about again. And so one has to think of that too in terms of thinking about what kind of economic freedom actually exists in these countries.
And none of this should be taken to minimize or dismiss the fact that China's liberalized considerably over the course of our lives, and that this has let millions of people get out of poverty and is making a big difference in the world and has improved all of our standards of living. It's not a free country in the full sense of that term, and it's not fully free in one sphere and then enslaved in the other, so long as it's not free everywhere. But if you look at the history of Europe liberalizing and of other places liberalizing, it often starts this way, and hopefully it will progress, and hopefully the need for freedom of speech and freedom of thought will be recognized as an absolute at some point, enshrined in documents. There'll be some kind of revolution or change to their constitution, right? And then from there, it'll be able to proceed to also recognize the economic freedom. But I don't think it could recognize the economic freedom as a right, as something that people are entitled to and that the government is there to protect, and yet not recognize that about freedom of speech. That there aren't places that do that, and I don't think there could be.
Agustina, is there anything we should take up before we move to the second of our questions? I think we've spent, we've said what we wanted to say about the first question, but if there's any other comments or questions we should take up in regard to it?
No, there's nothing, Onkar.
Okay, good. So let's then move to the second question. And the second question is related to the first, but as we were talking, or as part of what I was talking about, the first has a more historical focus on the development. The second is about the interrelationship of these ideas. So the question was, how does Rand understand the relation between intellectual, political, and economic freedom? And let me just remind you of one of the crucial passages. This was from the excerpt of the essay For the New Intellectual, which is from the book For the New Intellectual, where she wrote, or where she writes, quote, "Intellectual freedom cannot exist without political freedom. Political freedom cannot exist without economic freedom. A free mind and a free market or corollaries." That's closing the quote. I think this is an interesting and important perspective on the way that Ayn Rand thinks about the issue of rights. And we've talked, and we'll talk more when we turn to freedom of speech and censorship, which is the next topic. So but we've talked a little bit more broadly about that she thinks property rights are crucial to the implementation of all rights, including liberty, which includes free speech, freedom of thought, but includes such things as freedom to assembly and to associate with those you agree with and not to associate with those you disagree with. And to fully implement that, you need control over material resources. You need property for which you're sovereign, and in the area your judgment decides. So, and that's a connection then between intellectual freedom and economic freedom. So you can say that's the result of rights being protected, but both the rights to liberty and the right to property. But political freedom is the other, a way to look at it, tying it to what we've been talking about in terms of Rand's approach to political philosophy. It's that you need a government in order to have political freedom, but that means in order for your rights to be actually fully defined, implemented, you'll know how they are going to be enforced and why, and in detail about how this is going to be done, the mechanisms, the way the courts work, what their standards of evidence are. All this has to be defined, codified into law. And without that, you are not secure in either your right to liberty, and so freedom of thought, freedom of speech, or your right to property. If it's not, and we talked about this on Tuesday in regard to intellectual property. And if you don't know exactly what it is that your invention gives you a claim to and for how long. And so you can't plan, you can't engage in business transactions. You need to be able to do all of this. So I think a way of looking at what she's saying here is that if you understand the implementation of rights and what it takes, then the result is full freedom. But that when people divide up intellectual freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, they should think of it not as three separable parts, but three aspects of a total, which is the recognition and protection of individual rights. And I think that's part of the theoretical context here of what is going on. Greg, you want to come in and maybe bring up some of the comments that people made as well about this?
Well, I think the thing to really stress is what you were stressing, that these are a unity, and that Rand, in her analysis of particular events, which we were looking at in several of these pieces, is really alert to the fact that they're a unity and to opportunities to show how that's the case. That's the point that really stands out to me as distinctive in her approach to these issues. Looking through the quotes, through the things people brought up here, I mean, Paul is saying that without ideas of the rights of man, political freedom would not be possible, and without laws protecting the rights of man, free trade is not possible. I think that's a good as a kind of summary statement. Steve draws some connections to some other works. In particular to the epilogue of Mises's work, Socialism, where Mises says, now quoting Steve, that the socialist regime can't coexist with liberal freedoms like free speech and expression. And of course, Rand was a fan of Mises's, and they were friends. And I think she admired his work both in economics, but also his political positions much more broadly than other economists, because Mises would make these kinds of points. He then goes on to talk about Hayek's use of knowledge in society. Rand was not a fan of Hayek's, precisely because she didn't think that he had this kind of principled commitment to freedom that Mises had, whatever disagreement she might have had with Mises on more foundational issues. But anyway, Steve says about Hayek that he made the point that markets involve individual exercises of knowledge, in particular in contingent circumstances, and no one central office possesses all the contextuality required to coordinate the whole of society. I think she would agree with that, and that's a point also that my sense is in a different version in Mises. Ankar, you'll know better than me, knowing these thinkers better than I do. But the real fundamental isn't that there's a whole lot of knowledge and it's in too many places for anyone to coordinate it all, but that the work, what you're coordinating when you're trying to coordinate all of this, is different people's choices which are made, have to be made rationally by their own thinking as individuals. And so what you would be trying to do in coordinating it and in making plans for the whole society based on your coordination is not just something you can't do for a lack of information, because the information can't be all collected. It's that you're trying to make use of or manipulate or control objects in a way that's contrary to their nature. You're trying, in effect, to influence human action not by persuasion and respecting the ability of all these people to make their choices and outcomes to come out of that, but rather trying to control it like you would control mere objects. And she makes the point that attempting to deal with people by force is as impractical as attempting to deal with nature by persuasion, and that's what all kinds of government control has. So it's not just an epistemological problem of data coordination, which is, my sense is that's more how Hayek sees it. And that's, I think, his seeing it solely as that kind of a problem, or primarily as that kind of a problem, is, I think, symptomatic of the larger difference between them.
Yeah, I think that is true. It's in part, it's a metaphysical moral issue for her. The other formulation that I like, that I think goes directly to this, is the way that she talks about independence. And this comes up in Gall's speech, in particular, this formulation. So she says, independence is recognition of the fact that yours is the responsibility of judgment, and nothing can help you escape it. And this, that no substitute can do your thinking, as no pinch hitter can live your life. And it's not that you shouldn't allow someone to, it's nobody can actually do this. Nobody can think for you, and nobody can live your life. And her fundamental objection to central planning is precisely that it's someone's pretending that they can do the thinking for other people and they can live their lives for them. But it's not a life anymore if it's being lived for you. You've just completely negated what to go back to what is capitalism, the nature of man and the kind of entity or organism that you're actually dealing with. And I think she thinks of Hayek and not Mises as, yeah, he doesn't understand the nature of man, and Mises has a much better understanding that you just can't do this, not because we don't have a big enough computer to do it or something like that.
Yeah, and the fact that human beings can't function this way means that if you try to make them function this way, they won't function at all. It's not that they'll be living some other kind of life that's an alternative to the human kind of life. They will start starving. They will start having mass famines. They'll stop being able to have an industrial society, and it'll collapse. And you'll get what does in fact happen in socialist states, right? And then the question is, why does it happen? And Rand has an analysis of why it happens that is deeper than the Hayekian analysis, deeper not in the sense that it's better, although I think it is, but deeper in that it identifies the source of the problem as something deeper than just an impossibility of collecting all the information. It's, in effect, you're trying to interact with people in ways that are fundamentally in conflict with human nature, with what makes human life possible. And then if that's true, if her explanation of why these kinds of systems fail is correct, then she's right about this deeper issue as opposed to Hayek, and then that's a problem with Hayek's account. Which again isn't to say that he's wrong on the some of the epistemic issues he raises about the challenges in coordinating this information. He's not wrong about all of them. And all right, so shall we move on to question 3, or is there anything more we want on question 2?
Not for me. Agustina, anything that we should address before moving on to question 3?
No, I think we should move on.
Okay. And of course, we're looking at stuff that was posted in the Facebook group and so on, but you've got the Q&A forum here if you want to raise things about what we're saying now, and the chat.
There is one thing so Gordon just in the chat said, Hayek called this a synoptic fallacy. And I think that's the idea that you could have this person who has this overview of where things stand. And maybe one way to put the difference between Rand and him here is you might have the view that there's something there to be known, that if you knew it, you could centrally plan the economy. And his view is it's just impossible to get that knowledge. Whereas her view is there's nothing there to be known. There is no answer to what would be the right amount to force everyone to do this. What would be the right amount to centrally decree that shoes should be produced, if only we could know it. There's not a right answer to that question, because the very facts of how these things come into existence and how they're used and why they come into existence and are used depends on different individuals freely choosing to use their minds, making choices in accordance with their own values, deciding and determining what their values are. And independent of a market process, it's not just that there's no way to know what the outcome of that is, there's no outcome yet. There's no fact that is, there's no fact of the sort that the central planner would need to know that fact isn't discovered by a market. It's created by the individuals interacting in a market context. Created based on facts, but the sum is not a sum that's already there and found out by the market. It's a sum that's produced in the market interactions. Okay, so on to 3.
Yes. So question 3 now is so we had the first question, more the historical context. The second question was about thinking of the interrelationship between economic, political, and intellectual freedom. This third question now was more focused on so issues that are of particular relevance today, though, as Greg talked about at the outset, also in Ayn Rand's time, and she wrote a lot about this because she was very concerned about the issue of free speech and censorship. But so the question was, what distinctive features of Rand's view of free speech and censorship can we see in the criticisms she's making of the political developments of her time and some of the political widely, so legal issues as well. And then how might these points bear on today's debates about free speech? This is a part of the way, or part of the reason I think of this, or we think of this as it's a specification of the wider issue of the relationship of intellectual, political, and economic freedom, is that to really get what Rand is objecting to and what she thinks is the movement away from freedom. We're moving away from freedom in these cases that most people would just classify as, well, it's about freedom of speech. And she thinks of that it's about freedom of speech, but it's more widely about freedom. And you have to see that what is going on in these cases, we're losing our intellectual freedom, but that means we're losing our political freedom and economic freedom as well. And you have to think of these as aspects of the issue of freedom or of the protection of rights. And when you're losing one, you're losing all of them. And I think that, as Greg was saying, is very salient in her commentary. So if you think, for instance, of the writings about the anti-obscenity, so of trying to ban pornography or certain hardcore pornography, or it's not clear exactly, but that's part of her point of what is being banned. You have to think of it, okay, this is a violation of someone's freedom of speech or freedom of expression, but it's handing the government power to wield force in arbitrary, non-objective, not actually defined. It might seem like there's rules and principles and procedures for how this power now to censor is going to be used. But part of what she argues is, no, there is no principle here. There are no definitions. You can't have a definite, and this comes up a lot in the optional reading in censorship, local and express, that you can't actually have any legal definition of objectivity of obscenity that you would be able to work with. And you see the courts in part struggling with this. It becomes, well, obscenity, I know it when I see it. So how does a person operate that? So to know beforehand, like, is this going to be illegal or not? You would have to go to the government and officials and say, okay, look at this, and do you see it or not? And you'd be constantly begging for permission. And the easiest thing then is just, well, to not get anywhere close to the line of what they might think oh yeah, now I've seen obscenity and this is banned and this is barred. and there's many other ways in which she talks about that it's the government cannot wield this power in any objective way, and this is that this is true in other areas, and there's a cashing in on this, particularly of antitrust, of what she was, as Greg said at the outset, was a major concern of hers, of how it intimidates and destroys great businesses. But also what she was concerned about there is this was, I think she thinks, the first, or one of the major instances where the US government got handed to it arbitrary power that nobody can tell in advance, when the government can say you're engaging in restraint of trade, unfair trade, you're destroying competition, or you're colluding with it. I mean, there's a whole host of things, and nobody can know in advance of what the government officials. And that if you allow that, it just opens the door for other areas where the government will claim this kind of power. And unless you recognize the principle, you're not going to be able to oppose it. And both in the censorship cases, but this also comes up in Ideas versus Men, it's that, yeah, we've allowed it in one area, why wouldn't we allow it in another area? And there's no good answer. That is, she thinks there's no rights respecting or freedom promoting answer that isn't in terms of a principle, that yes, it's wrong in both cases, and you have to recognize that it's wrong in both cases, or you have to accept it in both cases. And so you see in these, you see it kind of in more practical or more hands-on detail the way she thinks the aspects of freedom interact and the protection of rights interact. And when you start losing that protection, you're losing it in all these, you're losing it in the area of intellectual freedom, you're losing it in the area of economic freedom, and you're losing it in the area of political freedom, because now you have a government that's functioning less by law and more by the rule of men and their arbitrary whim. So that's, I think, an important aspect to get from what she's, and why she's so concerned about this issue.
Yeah, and it's especially important to her, the effects of being ruled by men rather than by law on somebody who's trying to think. If you're not thinking and just passively obeying, it doesn't really matter much, and it's still evil. But the real destructiveness of force is that if you're somebody who's trying to use the cliche, think outside the box, to figure out new ways of doing things, you're not just going to do what everyone around you does, but you're going to, create a new company that does something new, or express a new idea, or in some way push the boundaries, go into the new, do something differently. That's a tremendous intellectual work to do. That's a tremendous achievement. And if you have to deal with, and there are all kinds of unknowns you have to balance and figure out how to deal with when you're doing that. And if you also have to deal with, someone might arrest me and I can't figure out when or why or know in advance how I'm going to do it, it's a tremendous burden. It makes this kind of thinking either impossible to do at all or impossible to act on. And it just shuts off the ability to innovate in these ways. And this is the real, this is what force looks like. And her discussions in the 60s era articles on censorship about the way in which the media is kind of under a silent reign of terror, in effect, I think really concretizes this well. And she thinks that businesses in general are operating under this, particularly very successful ones, because of the antitrust laws. Once you come under the target of the Justice Department because you're too big, there's really not a way you can play your cards right, other than by, and this isn't playing your cards right, it's just sucking up and currying favor with the various people who now are sovereign over you.
And it's interesting that it's widely viewed now, I think, that the 1970s was a period of stagflation. And that's inflation and stagnation, which was supposedly you can have it at the same time. The inflation there's a lot of economic and manipulation of the monetary supply that has all kinds of effects on business. But I think she thought, and rightly, that the use of antitrust has a major, as Greg was saying, a major impact on innovation. And that what you didn't see in the 70s is much innovation. And it was only once the threat of antitrust persecution, and she talks about it as persecution, lessened, that it's easier for the innovators to think, okay, I can innovate and I don't have to worry as much about what kind of force in some kind of arbitrary way, because I've crossed some kind of bureaucrat who thinks I'm too successful. And so how is that going to descend on me? And you see, it's certainly, there's technological revolution with the computer industry and so on, but there's also that the threat of antitrust diminishes. I don't think it goes away, but that it diminishes is an important thing to understand for the 80s and 90s and the developments.
Yeah, and if most of the fundamental technology in computers, much of it was developed in the 70s or before, but it wasn't commercialized. It wasn't made, at least not on the kind of scale that it was starting in the 80s, right? The idea that these kind of ambitious goals, like the Microsoft goal of a computer on every household running Microsoft software on every desk, these kind of Apple-like goals. If you think about Steve Jobs talking about wanting to make a dent in the universe, right? That's the kind of thinking that you can't do with a regulator looking over your shoulder. And I mean, no thinking can you do that way, but that's the kind of grand scale thinking where you really see this effect.
Another aspect of these writings on the anti-obscenity legal cases and the pornography, and as Greg said at the outset, the one we had you read, Thought Control, is the sort of a companion piece, or comes right after she writes Censorship, Local, and Express. And these are 6 issues of the Ayn Rand letter, because there are 3 parts each of them. So she considered, I think these were very important to think about these. And I think one aspect that is underappreciated is how early Ayn Rand saw that the conservatives were turning towards religion, and that this was becoming a major animating force. So she writes about this, comments on it kind of explicitly right at the end of her life, with the Reagan administration and the rise of the moral majority. But I don't think, it's not that this surprised her that this is what had happened. I think she saw this as a continuation of what the conservatives had been doing, at least since the 60s. I think actually even a little bit earlier than that, and that they're hitching of their program to religion. So, and this is a point that she makes in regard to thinking of that these laws against obscenity, that you shouldn't just think of them as they're prohibiting hardcore pornography. And in Censorship, Local, and Express, she expresses her opinion of what hardcore pornography, I mean, she won't even watch any of these movies. Just descriptions of them are enough for her to form an evaluation of it. So she's not defending that content, but she's defending their right to express this content. One of the points that she makes is that it's always the least attractive practitioners of a right who are first attacked. And then people think, well, okay, what's the big deal if they're not able to? So what's the big deal if some movie makers and so on can't produce hardcore pornography? But they're setting a precedent and a principle, and law. One of the things that she emphasizes is that law works by precedent and principles, even if people don't understand that that is what is happening. But also in terms of thinking of government and of government wielding now increasing arbitrary power, the way she thinks about it is this is injecting religion into the operation of government, that the whole focus on pornography, and this is as obscene and so on, is coming from a religious background and mindset, and it's the start of a religious view claiming that it should wield political power and being able to wield political power. And so she talks about these as what they're really about is sex and not obscene pornography or something like that. It's the role of sex in man's life, and the claim of the more conservative oriented that we want to control this and we claim the power to control this, and this is what they're getting. And I think then she thinks of something like Reagan and his kowtowing to the moral majority as a further development in this. But I think one of the things very interesting is that she's aware of this and spending a lot of time on this early. I mean, this is in the 70s, but she's already doing it in the 60s.
Yeah, a thing that people who are interested in Rand and the relationship, Rand's view of the developing history and her relationship to the right should really look at is in the Letters of Ayn Rand, edited by Mike Berliner. There's a letter to her in the early 60s to Barry Goldwater, from her to Barry Goldwater, having read his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, which was ghost written by someone at National Review. I forget who the ghostwriter was. She didn't know who it was at the time, but she knew he had used one. And she could identify where he was coming from ideologically. And she's warning against this, what she called an attempted takeover of the conservatives by professional religionists back then. And she likens it, and I don't think in her views there's any bit of hyperbole, to what she saw as the takeover of the liberal movement by communists. And her view was communists were always a small majority in liberal organizations, but just a few communists on the board of directors of it, a few communists in positions of influence were sufficient to set or direct or distort the whole agenda of these liberal organizations to make them, be moving in a direction that was, in effect, becoming apologists for communism. And she thought that what she called professional religionists, that is the equivalence in their evil and in their how anti-freedom and anti-life their agenda is, to the Soviet apologists and propagandists who were taking over the Republican Party. And she thought this was happening as early as the early 60s. I think it did happen. And I think this is also part of why she was so alarmed about the libertarian movement as it was developing, that a similar anti-life, anti-mind, anti-freedom ideology was playing this leadership role in that movement, namely anarchism. So we have, if you take three different ideologies that in some sense were pro-liberty ideologies, liberalism as understood in the 19th century and moving into the early 20th century, being taken over by communists, having this kind of outsized influence on it by communists. Conservatism, which was then defending the remnants of the American system of government from this socialist, communist movement or progressive movement, right, being taken over by the religionists, by basically theocrats, and then a movement that of people largely started because of her, who were inspired to being influenced in freedom because of her, trying to become a political movement prematurely, and in that being co-opted by Rothbardians or anarcho-capitalists. You see the same thing happening in all three of these movements. And in each case, for want of enough of the people going to philosophical fundamentals, focusing on philosophical fundamentals, and recognizing that what's needed here is a consistent philosophical movement, not just short-range political action. And then the only people who are going to the philosophical fundamentals are the ones whose philosophical fundamentals are moving the movement in a bad anti-freedom direction. Because that's what happens when you try to promote freedom without the foundation. without focusing on the need for the foundation.
Okay, so should we turn then to a little bit, so we've talked a little bit about why Ayn Rand is writing, as I said, a lot on the anti-obscenity cases, but why it's a major issue for her. Let's turn to the implications for today and more broadly of how she thinks about freedom of speech and censorship. So and that relates to the other things about antitrust.
Yeah, before we talk about the issues of direct relevance today, I think there's one other thing it would be good to bring up because it might surprise people, which is her view on obscene displays in public. So I don't know, do you want to say anything about that or should I take us into the topic?
Yeah, go ahead.
So she's really absolutely arguing for the right, for example, for filmmakers to make any kind of pornographic film they want and people to come into the theater and view it, or book publishers and bookstores. But she does think that what you could have out on billboards on public streets, or if your house is, even if it's 2 pieces of private property, you have a sign that I could see from my property advertising, some smutty movie or something with a obscene image, or any image. She thinks these kinds of things are properly subject to regulation. And I think that that's a view that a lot of people who today would think of themselves as First Amendment advocates, or certainly a lot of libertarians, but also a lot of liberals, would see as too conservative a view that they would reject. So just thoughts on what's distinctive about Rand here and what's driving this this position. If the thoughts from people on the chat or Encore, I'll pick up on this if we don't get reflections on this in the next couple of seconds.
Gordon said the consciousness of a conservative was ghostwritten by L. Brent Basel, brother-in-law of Buckley.
I knew it was a relative of Buckley, but I didn't remember his name. Thanks, Gordon.
You said that some free speech advocates today on the liberal side, libertarian side, I would say on the objectivist side as well, or would be surprised. And when I talk to objectivists, they often don't know or don't remember that Ayn Rand said this. I think one of the crucial things to keep in mind in how she's discussing this is that the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, it has to include the right not to see what you don't want to see, listen to what you don't want to listen to, watch what you don't want to watch. And when you make a point about, well, on TV, you can turn off your TV and so on, that's exactly what you can't do if you've got, every time you open your front door, you've got this billboard in your face that that it's something that you don't want to see and don't want to partake in. And that, I think, when she's thinking of it as there's regulation, she's thinking of it, what we're trying to do is respect the rights of everyone involved. And that, again, is that this is, it's not sort of written in reality, this is the way to do it. You need to figure out, given the kind of society you have, and the whole implementations of property and so on, how do you do this, that you're protecting both the right of the person who wants to express their ideas and of the other people who want to participate in that from the people who don't want to do it. And it's relevant that she doesn't think you can't say you can't say adult only entertainment, or it's like that would be okay, well, I'm not ever going to get any customers if I can't have anything up and so on. But nor can you put your whole movie, just run it up on the billboard and so on. The way she's thinking about it is we're protecting the rights of everyone involved, and that is part of what government has to do. And it's not automatic or obvious how to do that. It has to be it has to be codified into law, and there's complexity in doing that.
And I do think if you try to think about how those laws, so somewhere in the process of doing that, somebody is going to have to think about the kinds of things that Rand is concerned about it being left to these judges to determine in these cases. What are the standards of this community and so forth? But first of all, it shouldn't be left to the judges to decide that. So the law shouldn't be, you can't have anything on a billboard that's not in keeping with the standards of the community. The local laws or ordinances should be specific. No topless people on billboards or no this or that. And then those laws should be made, that's part of the function of the legislature, not the judiciary, to codify those standards into things where the judges and juries can decide, specific matters. Is this person topless or whatever? And then the reason for doing it is not to prevent people from seeing topless bodies or, acts of sodomy or something, but rather to recognize the fact that this is something that people don't automatically consent to doing, and then to figure out in what context constitute consent to this, like going into a store that says, XXX on its marquee, and then that what kind of videos you'll find if you go into it. So it's recognizing that these kinds of relationships ought to be voluntary and contractual, figuring out what would constitute something that could be reasonably expected by people to be unwelcome, bombarding them with things, and then creating laws that make it easy to tell, so that there aren't these kind of borderline cases all the time where you don't know if putting up your sign is going to be subjecting someone to something that they reasonably regard as something they shouldn't be subjected to. And these come up all the time. And there have been controversies about breastfeeding in public lately. And there's all these people protesting in New York that men are allowed to be topless and not women in public and so forth. And put aside what the right answer to each of these questions are. There are certainly some things, that you shouldn't be able to show everyone at every moment. And you ought to be able to choose to look at anything, so long as it's not, the thing itself isn't a violation of rights, like, a film of one person murdering another. And then the question is, how do we determine which ones are going to be in public and which ones not? And needs to be determined in a way that where the laws are specific, clear, and intelligible, and are reasonable. And if they're slightly wrong in one direction or the other, that is, they don't include something they should, or they outlaw something they shouldn't in public, it's no great tragedy, so long as you're left the freedom to, by contract, set up a private place where you can do the thing you're not allowed to do out in Times Square. But it is a great tragedy if you're not allowed to do that by freedom. It's a great imposition on you.
In the chat, Maria agrees. It says, in that case, you would be imposing something on people, and people must, if they want to watch pornography or obscene material, they must choose to do so.
Yes, I think that's what we're saying. Mark also in the Q&A says, wouldn't private owners of a given development set the standard for what is displayed via contract with those who own or rent in the area? For example, the way homeowners associations set the standards for quiet times and what could be placed on exterior walls and roofs. And I think, yes, that's absolutely what would happen, but there would still be cases where we're on the borderline of two condominium communities or homeowner associations, and the question is what could be done there. So if I own a street, then I could set the standards for what can be shown on the street, and other people can consent to come onto my street or not, so long as it's made clear what they're consenting to by coming onto the street. But if my street abuts against a street that you own, then we need to, what I make visible to your street from mine might be, subject to, there might be certain things I can't do such that they could be seen on my street from yours, and vice versa. Okay, so let's move on to the implications for the present day. Paul made a comment on this, which is maybe a good way to get into it. He said, during Rand's time, television was new and censorship of programming was common, either through self-censorship and government regulations. He says the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show come to mind. I don't know of any issue with the Beatles being censored, but there was an issue of Elvis that they had to shoot him from the waist up, and the Rolling Stones and the Doors, they were who were a little more edgy than the Beatles at that time. There were censorship issues there. Today attempts to censor free platforms like Twitter and Facebook, he says, internally and by the government are all the rage. And I'm not sure what he means by internally, maybe those companies imposing speech codes, but I don't think that is then censorship. And it's certainly, there's a lot of calls though for the government to regulate these companies and regulate speech on them.
I suspect he means the internally, the self-censorship that the broadcasters in the 60s would have done. And I think it's an important issue because it's for sure, I mean, we'll talk about more about this, but that companies like Facebook and Google for YouTube have certain standards that they're setting for content that is appropriate or inappropriate is not censorship. But if they're starting to set them because they're worried if the government, if they don't set them, the government is going to say, well, how is this possible on your platform? And we got to take control because you're not appropriately controlling it. Then it's self-censorship. And part of the issue with self-censorship, it's often hard to know if you're engaged in self-censorship or not. And that's part of why it's so desirable on the part of the government, because you don't even know if you should be objecting. Is it like, are these my standards? And when people bring up some stuff that's appearing on Facebook or on YouTube, it's like the companies think, yeah, we don't really want to give a platform for this. And versus, well, there's some pressure being put on us and you don't know often as running the company, what exactly are we doing and why? It's the same in the antitrust law. I mean, this kind of thing exists in the antitrust law as well, about what companies don't know now. Are they using antitrust defensively, or are they actually trying to penalize their competitors, or are they trying to just, you are coming after us, so we're going to come after you, and hopefully that will dissuade you. And it's a mess.
Yeah, and actually a particular case of this recently saddened me, of Brian Amerige, who's actually a friend of both of ours, was an engineer at Facebook and wrote a memo there saying that there's not enough political diversity in the culture in Facebook, and trying to promote, and I think he had some success in promoting via a internal group he started, more discussion of different heterodox political views within the company. But one of the reasons he gave that this is a concern in the memo, which was leaked, and I don't know if what was leaked is exactly what he wrote. I should mention I didn't ask him that. But is, a lot of people don't trust us to be able to make these kinds of content decisions fairly, given that we're known to have this kind of political monoculture, which I think is a really valid and relevant concern. And then he says, the president doesn't think this and Congress doesn't think this, or something like that. And the idea that Facebook should have to be worrying not just about whether their customers will trust them due to a problem that they really have, but whether the Congress and the president will trust them, and that this now has to be a factor in their thinking about this. And they're not really going to be able to separate in their thinking about this. Well, what do we think is the best way to do this? What do we think is the best way to maintain the kind of relationship we want to have with our customers? Think of employees in Facebook thinking about this. You can't separate that in a context where the government is threatening you, and there are congressional hearings that your chief executive officer and other people high up in the company are being dragged before Congress, and the president's tweeting about you on Twitter. You are under a gun, and you can't think about this as though you were not facing this real physical threat.
Yeah, I mean, the congressional hearings with Facebook and Twitter and Google, I think one should really think of these as akin to show trials that happened in the communist countries. And if you saw in one of them, I forget what the whole sort of the topic of the hearing was, but Google and they wanted YouTube didn't show up. And the amount of times that the congressmen went out of their way to say, Oh, and Google doesn't even bother to show up here. And the threat and intimidation of that was, okay, you're going to have to watch out now because you didn't show up to it's, and I can understand why they wouldn't want to show up because it's a farce what is going on. But there was such an element of intimidation in this. And one should really think about it as, this is being done in our name. It's the government doing this. And there should have been much, much greater protest. There's much more protest against the companies because of sort of, well, we don't like your political orientation. And there was very little criticism of the government. But the whole issue was a government intimidating private individuals because they're not doing or saying or helping other people say and promote ideas that the government says, well, this is what should, or some government officials say should be promoted, or you have to do more of this and less of that. And you have someone like Ted Cruz, I mean, grilling Mark Zuckerberg, and to the level of, have you ever done this with Planned Parenthood? And have you ever done? I mean, the whole thing that the government conveyed was, we're going to take over your company down to this minute level of decision making if you don't do what we want. And that is what it was like living under communist countries. And this is, I think, it's this kind of atmosphere that Ayn Rand saw with the antitrust and with the FCC, and why she was so adamantly against it, because this is what it looks like when you have a government that just wields arbitrary power and terrorizes people.
And what's really scary in the social media companies' case is that you're seeing them targeted now, and I think targeted is the right word. You're seeing test balloons about doing things to them from both sides of the political spectrum. So from the right, we have these concerns. Are they censoring, in quotes, right-wing views, right? What about the fact that Diamond and Silk were banned? And what about what happened to Alex Jones and so forth? So the idea that they're doing something illicit with respect to right-wing views. Maybe they have a bad policy with respect to them. That's a question, whether we should whether you want to use these sites or not because of their policy. But the idea that they're doing something wrong with respect to right-wing views that is somehow akin to censorship and that requires the government to step in. And I think Ted Cruz among politicians and Dennis Prager among private individuals are the real ringleaders of the witch hunt against, or of the mobbing up on these companies now. And I think both of those people are anti-freedom individuals in their orientation. So that's on the right side. But on the left side, you have all of this constant bemoaning of these companies for allowing or not being hard enough on or whatever, bullying, hate speech, and so forth on their platforms. And so there's all kinds of concerns about this, and also about whether they're being vigilant enough about foreign actors and propaganda on their platforms, which was the kind of thing that originally prompted some of the congressional hearings. Right? So you have both sides vilifying these companies, and both seeing them as, in effect, too powerful because they're too big. Because they created services that we all use, now they're too powerful. They shouldn't be allowed to control these services, either with regard to, they shouldn't be allowed to not ban certain people who the liberals think shouldn't be allowed to be speaking there, or they shouldn't be allowed to ban certain people who the conservatives want speaking there. So there's no good course for them to take. And there is no good course for them to take. And so what are they going to do in this situation? It's very unclear what they can do. Even the company itself might get into a position of wanting there to be government regulation of this because it's unable to make choices where it's going to come under attack for politicians on both sides. And it's a very ominous situation, I think, to see being attacked an industry that has made the communication of ideas so much more possible, so much easier, that has led to a flourishing of communication, and that it has led to a lot more diversity in politics than there had been prior to them, and a lot more voices being heard.
And one of the other interesting aspects, and it is the use of antitrust here, and I think it reinforces why this was such a major issue for Ayn Rand, and that she could see that this is if not opposed and opposed on principle, this is an unchecked and uncheckable grant of arbitrary power to the government, and it's going to rear its head in its ugly head in various ways. And she comments that if someone said in the late 19th century, when these are being passed, this is going to lead to an attack on free speech, that nobody would believe that kind of thing. But you have to understand the principles involved, and both sides are invoking antitrust to go after companies that are involved in the expression of ideas. So social media companies, but more widely of other more traditional media companies like the Washington Post, like the New York Times, like CNN.
It was the CNN Time Warner merger, right? That Trump blocked, or the Trump Justice Department blocked, and it's unclear why, but it seems like, possibly out of animosity against CNN. And of course, there's the constant, not constant, but it was constant during the election, boo-hooing by Trump about the Washington Post, which was actually doing some of the best reporting on him. And Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, and him making all kinds of insinuations about Amazon being a monopoly, and wanting to use antitrust against them. Now he says that the social media companies are in a very antitrust situation, and the Justice Department is investigating them. So we're seeing this now from the right, but I don't have any doubt that we will see this happening from the left the next time we have a Democrat.
Yeah, and Hillary Clinton, I mean, more than hinted at something like Exxon is, and its funding and support of climate, or scientists studying the climate with whom she disagrees with, that she's going to do something about this. And that is not an idle threat, precisely because antitrust laws exist. And every company, and particularly when you're the size and as successful as Exxon, knows that one of the things that she could do is use the antitrust laws to really damage the company. So it's again, it encourages that Exxon will self-censor. But self-censorship is censorship. I mean,
and it's not just that threat from Clinton, right? So there were, around the same time, several different state attorneys general filing suit against fossil fuel companies and related companies under securities laws, which are similarly vague, or at least that's the worry about them. So what Clinton said was, it wasn't specifically an antitrust thing, but I think you're right that antitrust is behind the fear that companies have to have a politician. Right. And then other leftist politicians were making these same kind of moves with other laws at the same time. And I think when I was saying I don't think it's just the Republicans, I think the Democrats will do it too, I mean specifically against media companies. But it's a free speech issue with Exxon as much as it is with the media companies. Should we say a couple of topics we had under this heading that it might be worth it saying a word or two about? First of all, I think we need to distinguish the question of what we or anyone thinks would be the best policy for social media companies to adopt regarding content. We have to distinguish that question and those kinds of, call them product questions, from the question of what should government's role be regarding this. And the answer to the second one is none. The government should not be involved in this kind of question, except that, things that are illegal to say anywhere, like incitement to violence and so forth, should also be illegal to say on a social media platform.
And I just add to that I think there's what we've talked about, the positive role of government, and you brought up bullying and I think there is such a phenomenon as cyberbullying, the intimidation, and there's new legal thinking that has to occur about, like, when does this really rise to the level of threat or incitement? And it might be different in the social media context and how to think about it than of a print journal or something like that. And that, like, this is the kind of thing the government should be doing, and it's doing exactly the opposite. It's not trying to actually protect rights, but is trying to seize power and bully companies, and it has no role in that. So it has no role in setting policy, but it has a role in setting some laws that, because this is new technological development, that there's new issues that have arisen, I think.
Yeah, and particularly regarding things like incitement to bully. So, you know, if one person sends you an unwanted message on something, you can ban them or whatever. But there's an issue of, is there a type of harassment you could have online? What if somebody sets a Twitter mob after you, sending you things? Is that person guilty of something? I think, does Twitter have an obligation to stop them from doing it in some way, or to cancel their account if they do? And so I think there are questions, but they're questions that would come up under existing law, like what is there'd be, you know, new things written under the law, like what does harassment online look like, in light of the kinds of abilities we have to filter what comes to us, what level threshold would something have to rise to be harassment and so forth. But to, on the one side is the government shouldn't be, so there might be some needs for some laws or adjustments to laws in those directions, but not trying to dictate what the company's policies ought to be. And then you can disagree or agree with what the company's policy should be, and probably different companies should have different policies to cater to different demographics of users who have somewhat different preferences. But if you disagree with their policies on something, if you think the direction Facebook or Twitter is going is the wrong direction, you know, complain to them, go to a competing product, but be sensitive in your expressions of your disagreement to the fact that there are people who are trying to put them in chains now. And you're not, if you're someone who values freedom but just doesn't like the way this product is, this is being developed now, someone who doesn't like the way the product is being developed now and wants to lock the people up for it is not an ally. They're an enemy. And the same goes now, not just for social media, but for attacks on traditional media, on television, on print journalism. It's easy to pick on any media outlet because there's a lot wrong with all of them. But what we're seeing now in America, and we've seen it at times in the past, but I don't think we were seeing it much, for example, in the 1990s or in the early 2000s. I think we started seeing it with Obama. Is, again, with Obama, we were seeing it with Kennedy and so forth back in the 60s, is politicians directly attacking media outlets. So Obama railing against Fox News, and then at a much larger level, Trump railing against CNN, the New York Times, and not as much the Washington Post as he used to, but at one point the Washington Post. And this is a different kind of phenomenon, precisely because the president has so much, or the executive branch and the government in general, has so much unaccountable power over these companies that for them to be making statements about them being fake or the enemy of the people or not legitimate journalism, I forget the exact phrase Obama was using against Fox, but he was pretty harsh on them in ways that I don't think he had any right to be, given that he's speaking as the president, not as a private citizen. And in your own criticisms of companies that deserve criticism, if you think they do, you have to, I think, take into account that anything you say is now being said in a context where guns are being waved around at these companies.
And one of the other things that I think of as new, or at least as pronounced in a way that hadn't been, so you made the comment about social media companies and they're being attacked on their very platforms by, so on Twitter, on Facebook, about how could you do this and how could you, I mean, in quotes, censor, they've enabled all kinds of people to have a voice and a platform so that to be able to amplify their voice and in kind of unprecedented ways. I think part of what's unprecedented, or at least it's how pronounced this is, I can't think of this in earlier days, and certainly not in the 90s or 80s, is Trump is the sort of the card carrier for what he's accusing them of. So he's accusing them of making stuff up. And yet in every of his speeches and comment, he makes things up all the time. So if anyone actually cares about fake news or fake facts or made up, it is the first person you would worry about is that your president is continuously makes up things. And so it's that he can do it, but that a private citizens can't do it. That a government official that we can make up anything and distort the facts and engage in completely arbitrary pronouncements. But if any of you dare to do this, that we're going to descend and unleash our power against you. This is new, I think.
And in a way, it's worse than even that, because if it's any of you point out that what I'm saying is BS and arbitrary and that there's no evidence for it, I'm going to come down on you. I mean, there's a lot wrong with a lot of conventional newspapers. The New York Times has much to be desired about it. But almost every negative thing that Trump has said about it is attacking these entities for their virtues, not their vices. They have vices, but that's not what they're under attack from by Trump. And if you're someone who's been aware of these vices for a long time and has been worried about them and been critics of these papers, good for you. But you now are in the context of having to think about how to make those criticisms when dubious hating on the companies for their actual virtues is now being said from a position of political power, which is a very scary place to be. And that's part of the context that you have to now keep in mind in how you understand and articulate your criticisms of them, which again, criticisms should be articulated and stated, but in a way that's aware of the political context we're now unfortunately living in. All right, Shel, is anybody asking any questions specifically about this intellectual freedom in an age where we're getting from, well, first Obama and now from Trump, attacks on the media? I don't see that. So shall we move on to question 4 about the separation of church and state and economics and state?
Yeah, and okay, so we have 15 minutes left, so to think what can be done in that. So this was Ayn Rand often in talking about her view of capitalism and what the full recognition and implementation of the principle of individual rights, what that means and what that entails. She often makes this comparison between the separation of church and state as a principle and as a founding principle of the American system of government, that something similar should have existed in the realm of economics, or the relationship of economics to state, so that just as there's a separation of church and state, there should have been, but unfortunately wasn't, a separation of economics and state. And she will sometimes say that it's for the same reasons and in the same way that there's a separation of church and state, there should be a separation of economics and state. And I think one of the important things to recognize about, I think, why she's drawing this comparison and why she thinks of it as the same issue, in essence, is part of what we were talking about earlier, of that intellectual freedom, political freedom, and economic freedom are aspects of the protection of freedom, have to be thought of as a unity. But there is a progression in the understanding and then the demand for these freedoms, and that it was first, she argues, and this was in the Ideas versus Men piece, that it's in the realm of intellectual freedom that individuals are demanding that their rights be upheld and protected, and then it becomes more in the economic realm, and it's understanding that economics is the implementation of knowledge in the field of production, the creation of values, of property, of new forms of property, and of moving forward in that way, in the same way, and for the same reasons that knowledge can expand and move forward. And so the watchword of the Enlightenment of we're entering an era of unlimited progress. That's both in terms of the expansion of knowledge and the expansion of production and trade, and that you have to see it as infused, that is production and trade, as infused with the mind and with the ideas, and a rational mind innovating and moving forward. And that the real, in terms of thinking of church-state separation, and part of the reason to have you read the short article on political crimes is that the government has no ideological role to play. It's not concerned with the ideas that the individual citizens hold. It's not policing their freedom of speech. It's not policing their religious ideas, and more broadly, and this, when you read the best articulations of the principle of church and state, it was understood as an aspect of intellectual freedom, that the government has no role in the whole realm of ideas, religious ideas, scientific ideas, artistic ideas, and that from the flip, so that production and trade involve ideas, and if the government is starting to say it can control and dictate what happens here, it's dictating over the mind and its function in producing and valuing. But from another perspective, that if you allow a church or a religion to wield political power, now you've handed power to one group to enforce their ideas on everybody else. And the same is true when you grant that the government has economic goals. So there's a vast difference between having what you had in the 19th century, experiments with socialism in quotes, but that means of little communes, or you can think of in Israel of kibbutzes and things like that, where people say, okay, what we're going to try to do is have things in common, and everyone's going to partake, and it's going to be that some work, but other people reap, and we're going to try to set something up like this. To do that where it's voluntary, and the people involved in it are agreeing to it, and there's even issues, I think, about what you can agree to in regard to this. And these kinds of little communes, they failed. But there's a difference between that and saying we're going to impose our economic ideas and schemes on everyone else and on the country at large, and in all kinds of different ways. We're going to have a central bank. We're going to manipulate the money supply because this is how we think it should grow. We're going to encourage some industries and discourage others through tariffs and so on, because this is how we think you get economic growth. So that's all. It's similar to someone imposing some other theory, whether it's a religious theory or doctrines on everyone. She's saying that is impermissible, and when I think it's important that she puts it as it's not the separation of economy and state. And Greg, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. There's obviously a role for the state in the economy, but she puts it economics and state. I think you would think of it as economic theory and economic ideas, that the government has no role in enforcing any kind of economic outcomes goals because it's supposedly desirable, right, good, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, does the government have a role in the economy? I think in the same way as it has a role in a church. If someone shoots someone in a church, or some church starts practicing human sacrifice as one of their sacraments or something, then the government has the role there, the same role it has everywhere else, which is to go in and protect individual rights. But it doesn't have, and likewise, if somebody steals or some company produces a product negligently that blows up and kills people, or it pollutes in ways that pose objective threats to the, or does something dangerous in ways that pose objective threats to the lives and limbs of the people around, that if it does anything that's wrong on grounds other than economics, it has every right, every responsibility to go and prosecute them and prevent them from doing it. Just as if a church does anything that's a violation of rights on any grounds other than religious, that is, what makes it a violation of rights on some grounds other than religious, it has every reason to go, and every need to go in and do it. So it's the principle of rights tells us what it's the government's job to do and protect. And it has no special or further role in economic transactions or in intellectual transactions beyond that basic one. And it therefore shouldn't have any policy as regard to what ideas become popular or not, and shouldn't have any policy as regards to what the GDP should be or what industries there should be. So let's move on then to our last topic, which is, why does she think that this perspective, this view of freedom, is incompatible with altruism? And we had a comment by well, I think, Ankar, you have some more general remarks you might want to make on this before we give time at anyone's comments.
Yeah, I'll make a few comments about John Stuart Mill, and one of the reasons for assigning the piece on thought control is that it's Ayn Rand's lengthiest discussion of John Stuart Mill and his relationship to the understanding of capitalism in the defense of freedom. And she's quite critical, to say the least, of Mill's of approach. And I think it's very useful for thinking of it from the perspective of rights. So we asked that why does she think altruism is incompatible with freedom? But that means for her, in part, why is altruism incompatible with the idea of rights? And the idea of an individual right is that an individual has a claim to be able to, and if you think of the rights to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, it's a claim to his individual life, his thoughts, his ability to communicate with other people, associate with other people, to produce and pursue his own happiness. So it's a radically, to say it's individual is not just individual in its exercise, but in its goal, that the individual is pursuing his life and his happiness. And he doesn't have to seek or beg permission from anyone else to engage in this project of pursuing his life. And that a government is instituted in order to secure this ability for each individual, but as individuals. There's no goal beyond that than of the individuals each pursuing their life and happiness. And Mill's, I think when you read on liberty, my perspective on it is there's many important details about why freedom of thought and freedom of speech are important. But the whole argument is in the context of, yes, you want to control and regulate the individual, and that's your moral right to do that. But you shouldn't do it because all kinds of benefits ensue if you leave the individual, particularly the innovator, the person who doesn't follow the crowd. So if you would grant him some freedom, you'll be better off. And so it's from your collective perspective. Yes, you have the power to silence him if you wanted to do that, but you're making a mistake if you do that, is his argument. And so she viewed this, I think, as the first major step of appeasement, that it looked like, for the American system, that it looked like he's upholding what the Declaration of Independence is upholding, that is the individual's freedom of thought and freedom of speech, but it's now all conditional on does the group or the collective or society agree with this? And it's sort of the theoretical justification that the standard is something like the public interest or the common good, which then in later things that when she talks, like she says, is all over the place when she's writing what is capitalism. So it's, I mean, in every piece of legislation and every aspect of the government's functioning, front and center as well, but what's in the public interest. And that Mill is one of the major people responsible for this. And it's a form of altruism and a form of collectivism. The altruism aspect is that you're essentially living for the happiness of other people. You can count yours a little bit in that whole goal, but you're essentially, and if there's any conflict, you're to subordinate your happiness to the greater happiness of the society. So I think it helps flesh out why she thinks altruism and rights are incompatible.
So since we're really at the end of our time, do we want to just widen this from Mill and the particular arguments against utilitarianism and say why, in essence, is freedom dependent on egoism? And I'll say a bit about that, and then if you want to add anything. Freedom is fundamentally a requirement of an individual for life in society to be an unalloyed benefit of him, for it to be a benefit to him. But then if we want complete freedom, for it to be an unalloyed benefit to him, right? For it not to be, well, I get this, but I lose that. And it's from this individualist perspective of an individual thinking, my life is my own. I want to lead. I have the responsibility and the desire to pursue my own happiness and find my own happiness. It's only from that perspective that reason plays this, that you can appreciate the centrality of reason in the individual's life, that it's the individual who has reason, who has the choice to use it, who's free, free metaphysically, that you recognize that all values come from an individual's valuing something, recognizing it as a value, making a plan to pursue it, coordinating his life around that. Once you recognize the points that were made in man's rights, the nature of government, and especially in what is capitalism, leading to the idea that values are objective, well, those points apply only when we view people as individuals, individually forming and pursuing values. And values then for themselves, right? Because they're the valuers and the achievers of the values. And it's that context, that way of thinking, that gives rise to the concept of rights, that gives rise to the need of freedom. And it was a kind of partial grasp of that in the Enlightenment, Rand thinks, that gave rise to the principle of rights that was formulated in Locke and accepted by America's founders and is embodied in our laws and our fundamental law and in the fundamental law of other countries that were influenced by this. But it's that principle that gives rise to freedom, and it can only be defended on that basis. And as soon as you introduce some compromise into that idea, or you fail to make fully articulate that idea, and so leave room for compromises to it, so long as you have the idea that some things are good, independent and mandatory and obligatory, independent of individuals working out what values they want to pursue and want their lives to be about, then there's no basis to say that those goods shouldn't be forced on people. If they're good intrinsically, good independently of anyone's mind or thought, or if what makes them good is merely someone's whim, then there's no reason for the person who thinks that he's grasped that they're good, independently of their relation to other people thinking in life, not to force them on other people. And there's no reason for a majority that thinks that it's grasped intrinsically the good, or that it creates the good by just willing it, to not force it down everyone's throats. And what we see in the idea of the public interest, and what we see in the idea of religion playing a role in government, as Rand is worried that the obscenity laws are the beginning of its reasserting religion's role in government. What we see here is an intrinsic or a subjective view, a view where value is not valued by the individual, placing, therefore, force and the enforced will of some above the individual's own right to his life.
I think that's good. We're 2 minutes over. Is there any last question, Agostina, that you think it would be good for us to take up that's sort of a wide question about Rand's political philosophy?
Nothing has come up today, Onkar.
Well, good. Thank you, everyone. We're looking forward to seeing some of you at Ayn Rand Con. Well, tomorrow we're headed out there, right?
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for participating, for the comments, for the questions, and look for in the future. We'll be doing some more webinar series like this. But this is the end of this 6-part series.
Okay.
And thank you, Agostina, for all your help in administrating this.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. And until next time.